Hello and welcome back to Crew Parley. Normally on this channel, we do Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit, and this is Crew Parley. I submitted a prompt and you all respond. This one is about moments in games that haunted you. From Mr. Foot originally, we worked on a bunch of Crew Parley prompts together a little while ago, and this is one of those. Is there a moment from a game that haunts you? One that you cannot stop thinking about even weeks and months after experiencing it? If so, what are those moments? I have some that come to mind, but I want to hear other people's moments. And I added, any thoughts about why this or that moment really stuck with you? Or perhaps you feel it's a moment that more universally sticks with lots of players. Why might that be? I was hoping that we would see a bit into the weird world of personal disturbances, where exactly what sets each of us off kilter varies a fair bit, and for some of us, maybe we really like that feeling. And some interesting responses. First of all, I think it is worth acknowledging that this is something that not everybody would be that comfortable sharing. And I might have been emboldened to do this because it was partly Mr. Fruit's suggestion to ask about this. If this was strictly a question I came up with, I might have gone, nobody will tell me that. But you encouraged me a little bit, and I'm glad you did because there were some good responses. But let's just acknowledge first that it might be something that would be vulnerable to a lot of people. I completely understand that this is one of the least responded to Crew Parleys ever, because of course it would be, right? It's something that can be hard to discuss for some people. Most people don't want to talk about when they were scared. So thank you for taking time to respond. I don't think anyone should feel bad if they didn't. Mr. Fruit, actually, you said, there are a couple answers I could give, that you're not going to. I've spoken about the chair from the original Fear and Hunger in a previous parlay. There's that time I accidentally gassed civilians in Cruelty Squad for convenience. That one scene in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, sharing the mental load for those who know, haunted me for months as I was replaying whether I made the right decisions. Harling's mirror from Ace Combat 7 is something I'm saving for a future parlay. And the end of Nier Automata fucked me up for a year in a way I'm not too comfortable sharing with strangers. I will talk about none of these for a variety of reasons. And I understand that. Yeah, of course. At the end of the day, we are not like friends. These are colleagues at best, you know? It's funny, a lot of people in the stream, you know me better than many people in my personal life, strictly as it pertains to game design subjects only, and then know almost nothing else, you know? Whereas I feel like some of my close friends know me very well, better than most people that are close friends know each other, but not necessarily that much about this topic. And so I completely understand this. There are some of these moments for me that I don't really want to tell all of you about, but most of the people that know me in real life know those things. I just don't want to tell you, sorry. We have a different relationship. It's like being colleagues at work. It's good to have boundaries like that. I don't know. It's weird to me when creators are like, hey friends, like, love you guys. That, I don't know, man. It's not a lack of affection for you all, right? It's just the affection is different. And I feel like that matters. Is that not more comfortable? Anyway. Yeah, I completely understand that in this parlay. And indeed, some of these are necessarily also going to involve potential triggers for some people. And I will give an effort to provide good trigger warnings and give you a timestamp to jump past them while you listen to this parlay. Because one of the examples we're going to discuss is Doki Doki Literature Club, a game for which definitely those exist. So I'll flag those in a few minutes when we get to it, and you can skip them if you want to using a timestamp in the description. Yeah, you know, one of the things that I was interested in this parlay is that I think haunting moments, or like if you think of horror type moments, that's not the only type of thing we're going to talk about in this parlay, but if you think about those, well, a lot of them are trigger warning prone and also very easy to spoil. And so currently, I have a pretty low opinion of these. Trigger warning thing isn't bad. I just mean that it limits how many people will enjoy those moments. And that is something that matters to me. It doesn't have to matter to you as a creator, but it matters to me. So it's something I've often shied away from. And I have to say, if there's any genre that I think is the least interesting or the least deep, such as I would think it would be a certain thing in music or games in general, for entertainment like movies or video games, for what you watch, horror is a genre I hold in pretty low regard. Not because I don't like it or because I don't think it can do good things, but because I think it has major flaws in the way of it being as good as it could be. So So I'm excited to talk about that. It's something for me, that means I want to hear more about it because I want to process that more. I would like for horror to work well, coherently, reliably, consistently, but it doesn't at all. And I don't think that it can, but I would be invested in it being able to work well. So I'm happy that we have some examples like that. Of course, what haunts you or sticks with you is also going to vary. You'll notice a lot of Mr. Foots examples. That's why I led with that. Are things that are not about them being scary necessarily, a lot of them. So, I gather that the Cruelty Squad and Cyberpunk examples are more like a high stakes thing you were compelled to do rather than something that is necessarily frightening physically. It's like a psychologically troubling thing. Just recently, I've been playing the Cosmic Wheel Sisterhood, and this has you make some similar decisions. There's a really interesting scene early on, for example, that is a minor spoiler, but I think this is more likely to get you into the game, and it's very early on, where Abramar asks you to sacrifice something for your pact, for your pact of power with them. And you're an exiled witch from a coven. And you can pick to sacrifice your immortality, the coven, like besides yourself, presumably, or the person you care about the most. And of course, if you're just starting this game, you don't know who the person that Fortuna cares about the most is. You may be role-playing it as yourself, in which case that will affect it. But a lot of players will think, well, for this character, I don't really know anything about who that would be. And I only know about the coven that they exiled me. And so they might be very nice mostly. And the game very intentionally does not give you that information. Your immortality is also like, come on, you don't even die. But at the same time, you kind of do, right? You wouldn't have died, but you now will die. It kind of does kill you to pick that option. That's interesting. That it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question for me, not at all because it troubles me. I'm not upset or distressed about that question. It's more philosophically, it is a very interesting move. It is a very well calculated question. It puts the stakes in an interesting way instead of just saying who dies. I think it's interesting. If you pick the coven, it's like a lot of people, but not people you care about. This is essentially a weird reframing of the trolley problem, but just with more interesting stakes set up, or maybe more illustrative stakes for many people. For example, I think a lot of people don't feel like there's a great real argument against saving more people in the abstract. And a lot of people say that they wouldn't change that even if it was people they cared about that in the abstract. But when you make it a situation like this, I'll just say personally that as someone who thinks the trolley problem is at a basic level quite rote and uninteresting, and it doesn't make any sense to not save more people. Pulling the lever doesn't make you culpable in a way that not pulling the lever doesn't. You're the active agent, so you killed the one person, even if you don't physically touch the lever. That's like a super pedantic way to think about moral responsibility. That's silly, in my opinion. The trolley problem does have depths beyond that, but on the other hand, in this situation, that is basically the trolley problem, I found myself surprisingly more amenable to killing the Lord. In fact, I think I picked to kill the Coven. And then later in the game, you may have some different feelings about that. Maybe because you find out they're really nice, or maybe you don't think they're really nice. But there's also other reasons why you might have second thoughts about that. You might think about how things could be in the future, and, ooh, I sacrificed that. Whoops, is what happened to me without spoiling anything. That's mostly the strengths of that game. So by the way, if you're interested in the Cosmic Wheel Sisterhood, I would say that's, if that sounds good to you, that is what the game does well. It doesn't do a lot else, well or poorly. So as long as that sounds good, then great. You want a visual novel that's about that kind of stuff? Sweet, go play that. You'll probably like it. It's cool. You make custom tarot cards that the game, like with an in-game image editor, and where you put the relative elements gets turned into effects for the cards. That's really interesting. Lots of other interesting things to say about that game some other time. But yeah, it doesn't have to be something scary. That's the point of this opening section. It might be something that is just thought-provoking in a certain way. And it might not be that it was so thought-provoking either. It might just be in an unexpected or very novel way, or framed in an interesting way. You know, I think it adds a lot to Fortuna's conundrum about who to throw under the bus, that you can see in the video game that as you're deciding whether to throw the Coven, your most loved person, or your immortality under the bus, you're floating in your little witch house in the middle of space on an asteroid, having been alone for hundreds of years. Like, that affects the decision. Like, you're looking at that and going, okay, yeah, but like, screw the Coven, right? And I reckon that's what most people picked, because it's really not that it's more or less people. You don't even know how big it is at the time that you're picking that. I don't think they tell you that. I know how big it is now, but anyway. You're just thinking, okay, but they did something that's definitely bad. So screw them, right? And that, no, that's not good logic, but I did feel that way when I played the game, you know? And that stuck with me. I think it was surprisingly effective. I don't think it's like the deepest game ever, is basically the point I'm trying to get across. And Mr. Fruit, you have a really good example of this that we'll get to a little later. I do still think it's useful to start, however, with the example that is the most probably what a lot of people are imagining when they hear a moment from a game that haunts you, which is a horror reveal in a game. So that's what we're going to talk about now. It is Doki Doki Literature Club, so I'll hand it off to Just Rusty. Just Rusty says, trigger warnings for this one. It's Doki Doki Literature Club, so self-harm, depression, and suicide from the very start of this response. From those who haven't played Doki Doki, I really recommend going in genuinely blind, other than knowing it's a game about mental health and those triggers. Sure, so what I'll do here is provide a timestamp in the description that will be, I'll write it in once we're done talking about this section. So you can avoid all of this for spoilers or trigger warnings, whichever you prefer. That's in the description. I happen to already have been spoiled by this game, so I haven't played it, but I'm just gonna read it. Just Rusty also spoiled out the rest of their comment. Very thoughtful. Cool. Anyway. I think famously, Just Rusty continues, the scene with Yuri where she stabs herself is the one people remember, as it makes you sit in the aftermath for a long time. But it's the scene where you walk into a hanging, which is the one that sits with me. Going into the game, I had no clue the game takes the supernatural/horror angle it ends up taking. I just knew it discussed mental health, so I thought, first playthrough, let's make the decisions we would actually make. Spend time with our childhood friend who's actually going through something, rather than the character I wanted to date. Then they'll feel not alone, and we can avoid suicide outcome on our first playthrough, which evidently did not work out, unfortunately. There's a bass sound in the audio that matches up perfectly with the stomach-dropping nature of the scene that made it one of the most effective horror moments in any medium for me. Great. So, as you can see, right, a great example, and in many ways what a lot of people are probably imagining. It's a moment that jarred you in a conventionally emotional way, as if it was a real-life event in many ways, don't you think? And you can see that Just Rusty has had, it sounds like, a quite organic experience where nothing really set them off to the idea that the game would go in that direction, yet they knew the trigger warnings. And I think this is a great example of the positive influence of trigger warnings, by the way. It's a case where I don't think that saying the game is about mental health, self-harm, depression, and suicide is very much of a spoiler in a high school. I don't know if you've been to high school, statistically you have, but no shit it's going to involve the, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't really set you off that the game is going to be a horror game, a psychological horror game, or a supernatural game, just because those topics are trigger warnings in a game about high school. Yeah, the game is like fluffy and cutesy looking. Okay, that's true. So that's a little stranger, but I don't know. I mean, there's just it'd be some pathos in the writing. Many games that I've played that are about that subject matter, lighthearted or not, just do touch on those subjects. So I think it's a really good example of trigger warnings having no real drawback. You can know that content is there if you want to avoid it, but it's also not really telling you anything about what's going to actually happen in the game to know those things are there. Fortunately or unfortunately, I think that's true of a lot of triggers. You can pretty much just tell people, and it rarely does anything negative to the piece. Mostly people argue that other people ought not to need trigger warnings. And I think that's a very different argument that I also think is really silly, but we could talk about that some other time. Ask about that for a parlay. Go for it. That sounds cool. I would love to lampoon that for 45 minutes, but we're not going to do it here. I think that's silly. I don't know. Just give people trigger warnings. Anyway, it's a case where that, didn't spoil it. It's cool that you were thinking, oh, I'll engage with the mental health angle, but I didn't expect that it would go this far. Great. And obviously on another level, it's also mildly amazing that you had this experience in 2025 or whenever, it's the mid 2026, but I assume you didn't just play it. Anyway, I don't know. Whenever you played it. Obviously that's hard, right? What happened when Doki Doki Literature Club came out? Well, people made YouTube videos about the horrifying scene that they experienced, of course, right? And so it's very difficult to avoid getting spoiled a little in that regard. And I was spoiled more than that. It wasn't any of you. Don't worry about it. It's fine. It happens. But yeah, I think that that's really interesting. I've often had a very critical bent about this style of entertainment in the past. For me, a lot of the interesting part about moments that haunt you in games is going to be how they are constructed. How can you do them yourself in your own writing or game design, maybe? And it's really hard nowadays, I think. Horror is a challenging genre to make consistent because as human intercommunication gets better and we enter the digital age and settle in, well, it's very hard not to be able to know where the game is going to go. And shopping for the game or scouting ahead maybe to get some reviews or see a little bit of gameplay to make an educated decision about getting the game makes it very difficult to impossible to not just have it revealed that the game is going to go to those places. And I therefore have had a rather not low opinion as in I think it's stupid, but I don't have a lot of faith in horror as a type of entertainment. I feel like it just doesn't clearly work in the information age. And I personally have found almost all, even good in theory, horror experiences fall flat for me emotionally. A lot of them I even think are theoretically well constructed. I think they're interesting. I think that chair from Fear and Hunger that Mr. Fruit you gave an example of that you talked about in a parlay 6 months ago. I don't know, that was creepy to me. I thought that was interesting. It's not like I thought it was silly or stupid because it was a scary thing or a psychologically dread-inducing thing, I guess. But I still feel like horror is a weak in that way, impotent genre in many ways. And it's very difficult for this type of situation to exist. Maybe that's not true. It's easy from the perspective of people that talk about video games on the internet to say, how could you not know that the game is like this? But market statistics have often suggested that a solid 50+% of players of most games buy them without any previous information about them. They literally just see the cover art or the marketing and they buy it. They don't talk about it online or see anyone else talk about it online. They don't talk to friends about it. They literally just go on Steam, see Doki Doki Literature Club, and buy it. Okay, I do feel like a lot of those people still have an okay chance of being exposed to something like this, but maybe it works for more people than I think it does. Go figure. Fair enough. I've just known many people that are the kind of person to read the last page of the book the moment they get it, which why stop? I don't know. It's you go ahead, I guess, but why? Anyway, I don't want to talk about that. That's stressing me out somehow. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy that we have this time together instead of me spending time with such another person. How glorious. You get my point. Maybe I have a little too little faith in horror, basically, as a way to successfully entertain. But this is one that's interesting in other ways. Again, I think it's interesting partly because it is something that we would likely react somewhat similarly to, just more, if it happened to us in real life. The way that the experience was memorable to you or haunted you was very similar to the way that it would affect you that way if it happened in real life. Whereas a lot of the philosophical conundrums Mr. Food and I had brought up are a type of an experience sitting with you where if that happened in real life, you would not at all have the same experience. It's specifically because it is an artifice that it's interesting. pulling the lever or not of a real trolley that is really going to hit people is an experience that just doesn't contain the same focuses as saying philosophically in the abstract, in our platonic meditation plane, do you want to do this or that? You know what I mean? It's just not the same thing. Whereas by relying on, I guess, surprise, but again, sort of a like touchstones of the real world, again, you spending time with a childhood friend who's actually going through something, like those elements, it feels like this was constructed more of you having a very similar to real life experience. So maybe that'll be an interesting category to keep in mind as we go along. To what extent are these moments that stick with us because they mimic in some way real life in a way that's only possible in a video game, but which is usually using the mechanisms of a real life experience? Or is it specifically because it isn't the real life experience? Yes, it needs to be a video game, but it's specifically because it's an artifice, not like a real life experience, that we enjoy it. And obviously, on an even broader sense, video games do these two things. This is kind of the specialty of a video game. You can sort of, kind of, vicariously experience something. And so the two obvious categories to want to experience are something that's impossible in real life and something you absolutely could have happen in real life, but which you would not want to have happened to you in real life. And there you go, two appeals of things that stick with you in games. Sure that you could think of others. But yeah, overall, I think a really interesting example to start with. It is in some ways the expected one, but you might suspect how relatively few people experience this. Maybe it is actually a lot of people. The potential unreliability of horror as an entertainment medium, the way in which it usually mimics the real life ways we would find something memorable, but just controls the scope of the impact they have on us in a video game. I hope you're doing okay. It sounds like it was surprising and shocking. And finally, just as a closing thought, also just I don't want to have a lack of faith in further progress. You know, it's entirely possible that the internet will mature its way of thinking about these spoilable experiences and get to grips with the information age doesn't mean just having all the information all the time. For example, I think it might be interesting to have a subgenre that indicates to people, hey, this is going to be the kind of game where if you look up marketing materials only, you might be fine, but if you look up a bunch of reviews and YouTube videos about this game, you probably will have a thematic turn spoiled. And so you know not to do that without having to pre-spoil that and say, hey, this game will do this, therefore don't do that. I think that could be useful. I'm also reminded, and I'll just note as a brief side topic, the romantasy like tag trend. Basically right now there's a thing happening in commercial romance and fantasy romantasy books that they'll kind of have tags attached to them, a little like trigger warnings, and some of them are basically trigger warnings. They'll say something like no abuse or like threats will be in this. So either telling you there won't be this thing or there will be this thing that is very similar to a trigger warning, sure, but they go further or just different than that and also include things like specifics about just what will happen, the nuts and bolts of the relationship. So something like forced confinement. The idea of this one is that for some contrived reason, two people that don't know each other that well usually have to live in a very small space together for a while. And so they kind of arbitrarily cohabitate for a little bit. And this can be romantic in a like awkward, but we get to grips with each other kind of way. Reminds me of those experiments they did where they had people, strangers on the street, look into each other's eyes and ask 20 questions to each other. And something like 75% of them like asked each other out afterward because people don't vet the people they date before they date them, apparently. Anyway, do you not just do that already? That's my first dates. I don't know. Just do that on your own. Anyway, you get the point. It's a little weird to go further and say, hey, not just warn me about the things that might be traumatic or jarring to me, but remove surprise and ambiguity about what you even mean by a relationship. Now, obviously, there's a gray area where you might consider those to be triggers as well. And I don't mean any disrespect to that. That's fine. I'm happy to respect that if that's people's boundaries. But I think we can all agree that for most people, if they want to know on a romantasy book that it says something like forced confinement, it's not mostly because that's a trigger for them. It's mostly because they think they want that kind of story and they want to get exactly what they want. rather than that they're like worried that that will be in the story. Is that a reasonable claim to make? Or at least a significant amount of people, that's why. Which is different than a trigger warning. You agree? It's more like a tag or sort of like a subgenre, kind of. And I think it's a weird trend. It's a weird trend because I feel like it misunderstands most of the point of experiencing a fiction. Even when we want to experience an event in real life that we normally wouldn't want to before, often the benefit is that it is still an event, like in a world, not something we perfectly control. And in the first place, what does it even mean to say, oh, well, you can expect that this or that is going to be in this work? I mean, there's many different ways to think about forced confinement, for example. That's just an arbitrary example. But let's say it was like a workplace romance. That could be a lot of things. I think a lot of us are probably imagining like an office space, but it could be many things, and those could be very interesting. I'd love to see a construction site romance. I think there's lots of potential there. I don't know, maybe that's I just want that kind of man. I don't know. Give me a break. Sure, I guess. But the point is, I'm not sure that seeing, oh, it's a workplace romance, actually gives me any real information. I think people think that it makes them feel like they'll more reliably get what they want, but I don't agree that it actually does, basically, is what I'm arguing. And so I also think there's a degree to which what I'm getting at by saying this, besides just that it's an interesting thing happening in romantasy, is that the internet in general may evolve its feelings about how we deal with knowing the contents of a book. We now can basically know any contents of a piece of entertainment media we want to experience before locking in, but do we actually benefit from knowing those things? There's this common ignorance is bliss saying, which is silly. Being more informed is better in virtually every possible way, and the idea that it ruins the enjoyment of something you had before is ridiculous. Obviously, being more informed will allow you to get that thing that you want more in the future. You don't have to enjoy the one that you enjoyed before. You'll be able to find even better versions of that. And it's preposterous to suggest that you wouldn't be able to. That being informed about the drawbacks of your childhood game you liked means you will never be happy again? What? No, I mean, it would help you find games that had the things you liked and not the things you didn't like, which would be fun, right? Of course, it would be insane to ever be informed if it actually was bliss to be ignorant. But it's not. People who think it is don't know what they're not getting they don't know the drawbacks of the ignorance that they should be including in that calculation. The point is, I think that a more enlightened view of ignorance is bliss is the idea that obviously thinking too much about a specific topic or having too much information about it at some point causes problems, yet obviously to a point is also beneficial as well. Some level of tagging the work is just trigger warnings, which I feel there's much less of an argument aren't just good. I think that's just a good thing. So I don't know. I'm curious to see how this goes in the future. At the moment, I feel like a lot of secrets in games are a little silly because you can just look them up immediately, but I would be curious to see how that will evolve over the course of humanity's next couple decades, because we haven't really been in a situation with the internet within our lifespans for many of us listening. I'm 33, so within my lifetime, this didn't exist, right? When I was younger and I played video games, often you simply could not get the information about where this thing was. But now that could not possibly be easier. Often the map you'll find online is better than the in-game map. So yeah, you definitely can look up basically anything in any game, even if it's pretty obscure in many cases. Watch this space moment. I hope we can agree. Yeah, let's give people who wanted to skip the Doki Doki literature part that timestamp. So that's 2835-ish. Welcome back, folks, if you jump past that section. We had just talked about the normal horror stuff that you would generally expect. The being scared of an event that startles you. The key thing as a takeaway that we'll move on to in the next section is this idea that some forms of something sticking with you are going to be the way they would work in real life, but you experience it through a game. Normally, you might not be able to simulate this upsetting event. You're not going to experience it in real life, but you could simulate it in a game. And so it's shocking to you mostly in the way it would be in real life, just diminished. Whereas there are also these abstract appeals, like the being asked the philosophical questions thing that Mr. Food talked about a little, where perhaps it's interesting because it is inside of the game instead. And you wouldn't really enjoy this in the same way in real life. I don't want to be asked what to actually do in an actual trolley problem situation, but it can be interesting in a different way, in theory, to think about that abstractly. Moving on to an example like that, Mr. Fruit says you're not going to talk about any of those. Instead, I'm going to talk about a moment that made me feel helpless in the silliest of ways. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is about the town of Termina that is about to be crushed by the moon. The player has 3 days to stop the moon from killing everybody in one of the earlier time loop games. It's essentially a game that takes place in the pre-apocalypse. Early on in Majora's Mask, you can go and visit the mayor's office. In that office, you see 2 groups of people arguing. One group is the town's guard, who urges the mayor to act in the face of calamity and to order an evacuation. The other group is the carnival committee that says the moon falling is just a rumor and canceling the carnival is unacceptable. The 2 groups argue back and forth for a bit while the mayor is stuck in between, unable to make a decision. It's a 90-second scene that I've linked below and in the description. I've played through many Majora's Mask many times, many Majora's Masks, and that scene never stood out as something noteworthy to me, Mr. Fruit says, until they decided to replay the game in mid-2021, as then world events, also known as the COVID-19 pandemic, were taking place. I just sat there stunned at how a game for mostly children managed to capture human nature in such a profound but simple way. Ever since then, I cannot stop remembering that scene whenever current world events happen. 2 sides argue, partly in fear, partly ignoring the evidence, staring them in the eye, in the case of the moon quite literally, as the decision maker sits there stunned, unable to do anything. Majora's Mask is often described as haunting, but it's this silly scene that keeps on coming back to me. Sure, and obviously in Majora's Mask, you literally just walked into the house after seeing the moon right above you. There's absolutely no question, just to be clear, that the moon will crush the town, or is on its way to crushing the town at the very least. What the hell is happening gravitationally? Maybe they don't know, fine. But there's no debate that the moon is there, just to be clear. The carnival people are, in that sense, just blatantly arguing in bad faith. Presumably the mayor hasn't ever stepped outside in their entire life because they're a video game NPC. This is a very interesting one to me. It's one where on the one hand, it's interesting because we get to see what would be frustrating if it was real politics, or alarming because there's a real emergency that's about to kill us all and people won't decide anything. But on the other hand is also interesting because it is something that kind of works with video game logic, and yet it's true in real life. It's kind of that rhetorical move where you make a critique, often used in comics, you make a critique of society by showing that in a comic context, or in a silly or gameplay context, characters will argue this overly simplistic thing, but then you gently suggest that actually that's kind of what happens in real life normally as well, which it totally does. I'm sure if you watch United States politics, even a tiny bit, which, like, why would you? But I know statistically a lot of you do. I'm sure that feels relatable in the modern day. Anyway, the feeling that one side is arguing from a perspective that is actually literally a meme, like they are legitimately pranking the people in the conversation, and that is the purpose of arguing that, sometimes literally just to troll them, and that is an actual legitimate stated political strategy in some cases, or like to spam them is become a popular political strategy, which is pretty silly, but that's what's happening. So it's interesting to see that represented in the game. But you see what I mean? The fact that it's a little silly, but then kind of does feel like this real life thing, is part of why it's effective in some ways. So anyway, I appreciate that scene a lot. It's also, a 90-second cutscene can be a little long for a game like this. I think it's really interesting when you make something startling in a game by just making it an irregular amount of the thing the game already does. So in a game with a mix of combat, exploration, and story, you don't actually add a new thing and shock the player because there's a mini game that is a fully functional trading card game inside of the game, but instead shock them by having there be 3 hours of combat back to back, or like a 10-minute soliloquy from a character, or in one of the Final Fantasy games, we get like a whole, I think it's a Final Fantasy game, like a whole opera is performed, and you don't just watch it from sitting stationary. There's a movie for 2 hours. No, you're backstage and whatever, but basically the whole opera takes place. And you essentially experience an entire stage production, just mostly from backstage, sure. But the story, you still basically get it. That's like, whoa, okay, it's a story and exploration focused game. That's still what you're doing, but this amount of it is somehow wowing in some way. I think that's interesting, and it doesn't prevent the game from being about what it's about. The game doesn't have to become gimmicky in exchange. At least I don't think that's gimmicky. 90 seconds obviously isn't that long at all. And the Legend of Zelda games, though the early Legend of Zelda games might be called terse by modern game standards, they're not that talky. They're not like this brief in their descriptions that often. So sure, like 90 seconds isn't that long, but it's still longer than talking to an NPC and they give you one line of dialogue and then they open up the shop, That's all I'm trying to say. So that irregularity, I think, is part of it, that it feels like something the game does, but often not this much, and so draws attention to that a little. Cool. I like that you are trying to solve the problem of the moon falling. Oh boy. Before you get too sleepy to survive the 3 nights, you're gonna have sleep deprivation because you end up, again, it's one of the early time loop games, mild spoiler or teaser for Majora's Mask. You'll be real sleepy by the end of it. But the interesting part to me is seeing other people complaining about or kind of trying to solve the issue as well. That has an impact, I think. It makes it feel gently real, or like the game is saying, we do take it seriously. Diegetically, all these people are going to die, In the world of the game, this is a real event, and the town's guards are panicked and whatever. I think that adds a subtle, not like immersion necessarily, but a pathos that would not otherwise be there. That it feels like the game is saying, hey, we are serious about this idea. This dialogue might be a bit silly, but this is a serious issue that would really happen. I think that's interesting. It's a subtle, gentle way to do that. And it just sort of feels good too. If you're the protagonist of a game, what you're thinking about is making the moon not fall, and then you walk into a building where they're also talking about that. People other than you are trying to do the thing. I think that's maybe humbling. That's just cool. But it also takes you outside of your experience of being just playing the character, which I think is something that promotes reflecting on what you heard. So it's easy to see in some ways why this would be a moment that would stick with somebody. Again, it's also an interesting example of kind of not that immersive form of surprising someone. We have the example in Doki Doki Literature Club where something that feels like a thing that would happen in real life, but just fortunately it's through the realm of a game. Whereas this is something that really wouldn't happen in real life. At least I certainly hope the moon doesn't fall on us anytime soon. And the gravity situation wouldn't be like, but anyway, whatever. Our bodies would tear apart anyway. Blood would rush to your head. We would all die or something. The moon wouldn't have to hit us. Anyway, you get it. This was not a necessary tangent. The point being that it's something more abstract like that. But I guess as we described it, I did actually say some things where the relative immersiveness or straight-facedness, the guards in universe are actually worried, does have something to do with how the moment is constructed, perhaps. So maybe they aren't as separate as I thought. But the point still stands that of the appeals to play a game, two very obvious ones being to experience a thing you could experience in real life but might not want to or don't have the opportunity to yet, or to experience something impossible that you therefore can't experience in real life. This is the latter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't about it feeling the way it would feel in real life. I don't know. I can see how if I encountered a real town hall in my town physically in real life, and this was happening, it would have a similar effect on me. So I don't know. Maybe it's just because this is a fantasy environment that I'm thinking, oh, it's different. That's interesting. I had not thought of it that way before. But yeah, an interesting moment. I remember thinking when I was a kid, I remember this scene. I haven't played Majora's Mask since then, so it's been a while. But I remember this scene only for the mayor. The mayor to me was a rich fop that wouldn't decide anything, and I hated that. I was such a judgmental little kid. I'm still a judgmental little kid. But I was even, I was actually young at the time, so there you go. And I I was frustrated. I had this NPC brain where I was like, oh no, he never leaves. He's an NPC. He hasn't even looked outside. If he just took a look out the window, this conversation would be over. But they can't do that because they're just NPCs or whatever. And I got mad at them in some way. And I got mad at that game. That was my first salty game. I was really young when I played Majora's Mask. Give me a break. But yeah, it was a game that induced much salt for me. It left a very different kind of impression on me. And not mostly that part. I mostly just remember looking at the moon and feeling like there's nothing you can really do because I didn't understand the time loop part of the game. If you're wondering what young, petulant Zandy was troubled by, that's what I couldn't find the time loop mechanic. To a different type of appeal as well. They might not be upsetting moments that haunt you, and they might not be thought-provoking necessarily. They might just be really cool. It might just be positive. Ragnavar says, personally, just confirming that it's the person I think it is. Oh, you're right, because they have the live stream. Got it. Personally, you say, I find that not many specific scenes or moments stick with me very often, but V4 Rusty's line, I won't miss, in one of the Armored Core 6 missions is just peak. Obviously, I don't know that line from the way I pronounced it. I didn't say it. I'm sure the way they say it in the game. Honestly, all of his big moment lines in that particular mission are great, but there's just something about how that one line is set up that just can't be beat for me. You said, I keep seeing either I won't miss or all or nothing. The last of the usually 3 lines that V4 Rusty will say in that specific mission. And I just keep coming back to that one scene. It's just that good. And I wish you had the chance to play through Armored Core 6 before this crew parlay just to experience it. I feel like that kind of thing will still work though. You know what I mean? So obviously this is an example of a positive one. I think you're implying it's badass, basically. I assume there's a moment where they're sniping or firing at the core of a MacGuffin device or something, and they, edgily say, I won't miss, and then fire their proton torpedoes or whatever. I'm not mocking it at all. I think that stuff is really cool. That sounds like something I will enjoy a lot when I play it. I think those generally survive being spoiled pretty well. It's interesting because when they get memed, they don't really work out of context in the same way that just seeing something that might be a trigger for you if it was in a story out of context may be less triggering in some cases. For some people it might not be, but for a lot of people the context is what's magnifying that discomfort. And for example, there might be people who don't like ideas of self-harm but may be unbothered by blood abstractly. It's specifically the context of the self-harm that they are bothered by. I can relate to that. So it's interesting here where I think as a positive thing, much of the time, the contextless nature of hearing it without experiencing the whole game robs it of its power, but also doesn't really spoil it. They basically say something else. It reminds me a little bit of anime fight scenes, or really fight scenes in general. A lot of people, in my experience, think they don't like fight scenes, and they're referring to fight scenes where nothing happens, or nothing plot related happens. My mom has a really pet example of this, which is the fight scene in the Battle of 5 Armies in Lord of the Rings. I don't know if I would really agree that this isn't a fight scene that is about plot in some ways. We won't get into it more here, but anyway, my mom is frustrated by it because she says it's just a bunch of people hacking at each other and there's no real story happening, which I can agree with in some points. If you rewatch it, I think there'll be some parts where you'll think, yeah, it's fine to do that, I guess. That's a different form of entertainment, but it's not easy to argue that that is storytelling for that part of the story. I think it's kind of not. And while I do think this is a reductive view, I don't think it's that reductive. For the most part, a good fight scene is storytelling. Character development and plot happen in the fight scene. So some examples of this. If it seems to you like, no, good fight scenes are just cool fights, that's fine. I just want to present this other perspective. For example, a character getting a new power or powering up during a fight. This is a really common shonen anime trope. The idea that just persevering and pushing through and the power of friendship is enough to make you stronger or something will often mean that the character powers up during the fight, or like the practice that would be how you would normally get better happens live and it's enough. And so they, level up either literally or figuratively during the fight. That's a very common trope. And I think that's a perfectly fine example of the story being told during a fight scene. The fight scene will be cool, probably cooler, because there's now this actual impact to these events people are doing. And the attacks mean things. Another example would be something like the events of the fight scene are very cool but mundane. Maybe there isn't even much back and forth, but the attack that is launched has additional context. So a really popular example is in One Piece. There's a scene where Luffy is rescuing a crew member from the world government, and she's being held hostage, and they say, you have to stand down, and some people say like, oh, you're declaring war against the whole world, it's just pointless. And Luffy almost unhesitatingly tells Usopp to shoot the world flag, and just basically unnecessarily really spit on the corpse of the organization with absolutely no hesitation. And it's just a great badass moment that is cool, not because of what they do. You could argue it's kind of lame on some physical level, but from an ideological perspective, it's great. And it's a moment where Luffy really has to put his chips down, that he really does care about freedom at basically any cost, which maybe that was clear before, but early in One Piece, this isn't often challenged that much. There's a lot of situations where, they meet Nami and she's just in an objectively bad situation. It's not really a moral quandary to try to save her. Same situation with anyway, Chopper is another one for me. But this is an example where we have to work through, you really do have to kind of be a criminal against the whole world. It's not just a fun adventure anymore, Luffy. You're a criminal now. And of course, later in that arc, we have the Impel Down, the Navy prison arc. Pretty interesting part of the show, in my opinion. It's cool, and I think a great scene. That is good because of the context. You see my point. It's not really interesting because someone shoots a flag. The cool thing is the context, and often even when the fight choreography or the fight scene is cool, it's made all the better by the fact that there's emotional impact for the audience from each of the attacks. Another common example will be something like a move you've seen the character train with a lot is the linchpin that gets them out of the critical moment in the fight, or they were trying to land a combo for many hours and they finally managed to go for it in the fight and they do it. And it's satisfying because it's cool. They finally get to do the thing they're practicing, but also because they did it. It's a human perseverance moment and it feels empowering in some way. And I don't know, you hear a line like the "I won't miss" thing, and I'm imagining it's one of those that can inspire you want to have that type of confidence in those moments. And you love seeing other humans. I don't know, there's something in our DNA, I guess, that has us rooting for each other on a basic, typal level where we see other creatures like us succeeding and we go, yeah, we do that. That's a human thing. And I don't know, you know what I'm talking about, that fulfillment. And I think that this sounds like a moment like that. It's cool. A great example. And I think an example that shows that the positive examples are surprisingly kind of hard to spoil in a way. Again, you can watch a cool fight scene in a show, and I had this happen to me really recently. I jumped ahead in Gachi Akuda. This is an anime that I ended up coming back to and really enjoying. But I was watching the first episode, and I do not like the first episode. And about 10 minutes in, way too early, I said, I'm just going to drop this show. I was being lazy, but I wasn't being that lazy, so I tried jumping ahead a few episodes to see where it was going, since I found it so uninteresting at that early part. And everything was unfamiliar. I got really lucky and I hit a fight scene. If you've watched Gachi Akuda, it's the scene where Rudo uses his gloves in that way for the first time. You know what I'm talking about? And he gets a very unusual ability from doing so. Jabber comments that he doesn't know what the ability is. It's not really clear what Rudo's power is doing in the moment. So I got very lucky. I saw a fight scene, mechanical spoiler, and I just so happened to have seen a part where the characters don't yet know what it does. So, safe. Okay. But the fight scene was really cool. And I remember thinking when I watched it, okay, but it's just more fight scene, whatever. And I dropped the show. Later, for unrelated reasons, I came back and gave it another shot, and I've now watched all of this show. I really liked it. I highly recommend it, actually. I think this is a fantastic show. And just the first episode is a little slow and does kind of set up that the show is going to be about other things, but you could be forgiven for not knowing that. So just give it till the second episode. But longer than that, you should be enjoying it pretty much right away if you're going to like it. And I, having watched all of it now, going back to that fight scene, what was I talking about, man? That fight scene is sick. It's so cool. Presumably because I saw the same thing, but now some emotional impact had been added in some way. And even remembering it now, it actually has a little more emotional impact because I know Jabber better, the other guy fighting. He's their enemy, he's the villain, if you like. But he's a fairly major character in the show. And we get to know him fairly well, I would argue, or intimately, not in a way I wanted to, but in a way I needed to, apparently. And so thinking back to that fight scene, even context I got after seeing it makes my memory of it better than it was when I saw it, and better than it was when I saw it without any context. So that's interesting. An experience I recently had. Oh, what a cool! I'm a Jabber fan as well. I think he's a cool combatant. I think Rudo's power is cool. The power system of the show is really cool. What I'm saying is it should be a build system anyway. It always comes up without fail, without effort. There will always be a completely natural way to weave and build systems, and that's it. And this maybe not a very big one in this case. So yeah, I think that positive moments that stick with a player, it's interesting. They might have a unique ability to be unspoilable in some way. But why? The impact of the negative ones is related to the context. It is. And so why are the positive things more resistant? I don't know. I mean, there is. I don't have anything right now, but the thing that comes to mind is that there is a relationship between like a bad thing about a piece of entertainment and a good thing about a piece of entertainment are not often the same. So, often I've formulated this as entertainment is basically just good things and things that get in the way of those good things, not really bad things. And what we experience as something bad about a piece of entertainment is either something that gets in our way or something that would inevitably get in anyone's way of it. So for example, you don't like the prologue, it gets in your way of enjoying it, or the prologue is incredibly long, it gets in everyone's way of enjoying it objectively, at least to an extent. If the prologue is short, it might not get in your way, but it also might if you just don't like it. As a random example, you can think of it in a lot of ways. It's just a mental tool for thinking about how things are experienced negatively by other people and how you might like something and someone else might dislike something. And it might be that you don't actually disagree very much about it. It's just that they, for whatever reason, were focused more on this, or you, for whatever reason, overlooked this or that. Not necessarily that that's bad. A lot of people want to enjoy a thing enough that they can get past some speed bumps, and such is life. What's wrong with that? It's not really wrong to enjoy something that way, but neither is it unreasonable to say, I want the game to be about avoiding those speed bumps. Fine. And I think it's the same thing with enjoying and not enjoying things. Things having benefits isn't always of the same nature as something having a detriment. You know what I mean? It's not like if I make something good, the way to make it bad is strictly only to just invert those good things. Sometimes badness is just different, built different than a good thing. And so I smell something smelly, fishy in that type of philosophy that might help us eventually figure out why positive spoilers might be easier to withstand or might survive being spoiled better like this. But I don't have any other thoughts about it right now. I don't know. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that. Why are positive impactful moments, is what I'm going to call them, seemingly more durable to being spoiled? Or I suggested why. It has to do with the context. So then why does that seem to not happen in the same way for a negative event? Is it because you imagine the context more? It might have something to do with that. If I say a trigger warning for suicide, maybe that feels like it has a context attached to an extent, whereas positive impactful moments like this might be a little bit more random. Are they literally just more varied? I don't know. Let's put it to sleep for now. Another example from Ragnavar. You said, as another example, albeit less one that I come back to in memory and more so keep chasing, has been completing the A and B ranked times for Monster Hunter Wilds free challenges. I've always really disliked the way the sweats of the Monster Hunter community go about set building as if all of them are speedrunners, or rather, speedrunners when playing the run they actually upload, even if their math is correct. So I've always made my own sets and only looked into the meta for a given weapon in a given entry to get some direction on what's valuable and what doesn't work for that weapon. Thus, coming into an explicitly get a good enough build that you can actually play well to get to the top challenge is something I deeply wish more games with this kind of buildcraft and vague gameplay structure had. Warframe is a great example, as I've mentioned Deep and Temporal Archimedia almost being this, but failing due to Digital Extreme's response to their power creep getting well out of hand by disabling aspects of the game via modifiers that rotate weekly, which can make a week's Deep and or Temporal Archimedia too tedious to be actually fun, but other times tapping into all of the game's core gameplay. There's just something, it's peak flow, I reckon, about that satisfaction, not only in the completion of these challenges, but also when things are playing smoothly during them, that you can't get from other forms of entertainment media. And each type of game has its own potential max enjoyment, refinement of the game's primary loop, that should be strived to be found and implemented in order to fully realize the game's potential, if only it were as easy as typing that out. Ooh, that's a doozy, but I think I get you. The crux of the thing is that it's very satisfying in a unique way, and it can be a moment that sticks with you for a game's build system to click, or for a game's difficulty model to click in a certain way. Flow in games. It is a simple way to describe this. And this is a category of a moment that sticks with you in games that isn't very emotional or thoughtful, and is more of a feeling that you get from operating the game. It sounds like you're describing. It might also be your thought fulfillment that you come up with something clever in the game. Just last night, I was, as I'm wont to do, procrastinating going to sleep, revenge procrastinating by thinking about builds. And it was like 1 a.m. and I was trying in my head, because I'm quite comfortable with that type of thinking after all these years, to plan out this build in this game. And I was thinking about different cards that I could put in this one slot in this character's deck, and I needed more mana, and the deck just didn't quite work out, but I had this big combo plan that was going to one-shot basic content. It doesn't really matter. It's not actually hard content. It was a convenience build. And I thought of a way, a really unique way that only works for this kind of strategy that gets you a little more mana and makes this work, but will basically never be relevant for any other build using that character. It's very specific to this, and it felt like a system mastery moment where I had thought enough outside the box about what the game is allowed to do that I thought, oh wait, but you can do this. Like, you could just pull this lever that exists, but is kind of like over there in the corner. And it was very satisfying to reach for that lever and pull it and say, the build system does have a way to let me do this. So let's say there's two here. We have the appeal of just flow in the game, the feeling of operating the game smoothly and at a high level being very fulfilling. This is definitely a thing that can stick with you. I love that you included this type of more mechanical fulfillment, by the way, Ragnavar. That's great. And then also I think a separate thing is when you feel like you get the fulfillment of system mastery, I guess is what people usually call it. But I personally think this is often misconstrued as meaning you know all this stuff. Boo! Often it doesn't matter, or the game is made better if you don't even need to do that. I really like how in Path of Acra, they have the ability to just type into a search field whenever any build system screen is up, and it will just filter all that stuff out for you. You're looking for things that trigger when you walk forward, just type that in and it will gray out all the stuff in the build system screen you're on that doesn't do that and find you all those things for you. The game is good partly because you do not need to know all that stuff. No, here I would call system mastery the talent of being able to reach for the lever or manual to find out what lever to pull at the right time. Not necessarily that you know everything, but you know how to get every piece of information you need or every tool you might want to get. And so you have a systematic way of thinking about the build system. Rather than system mastery, I'll call it systematic mastery, perhaps, for now. And that, I think, is its own appeal that is related often, but separate in some ways. I think for many games, one of the big appeals is that you often get these together. Often the flow is achieved when you are able to pull that lever at the right time and make a build that clicks in a certain way, and then you also get the flow appeal. They're very connected, maybe, but I think it's worth thinking of them as kind of separate, and obviously the flow one happens in a wider variety of games to an extent. You could just like be playing a 2D fighter and have that feeling, in the same way that having systemic mastery for a 2D fighter can be ridiculously complicated. You might not be able to freely make combos on the spot in Guilty Gear Strive, but you could easily still feel flow in Guilty Gear Strive. It's much harder, I would argue, to achieve this systemic mastery. Whereas in many games with normal build systems, it's about as easy, if not easier, to have that feeling of systemic mastery versus flow. As you point out, Ragnavar, in some games there's a limitation that the flow is hard to achieve because the game doesn't offer a high enough difficulty for that gameplay loop. It's interesting what you said earlier about the Monster Hunter community sweats playing as if they're speedrunners. There's a couple ways you could think about this. It's people who only upload the runs where they do insanely well and then pretend that's how they play all the time. Like, it's fine, but just why do you feel the need to do that? It's cool that you failed a bunch of times, that you persevered. That's neat. What's wrong with glorifying that? But they seem to want to pretend that they're perfect instead, which is kind of lame. But also there's the element where a lot of people make builds in a way where they assume perfect play rather than assuming practical play. They say, well, if you were to hit every parry perfectly, then you'd want to build this. But if you miss sometimes, you'd want to play this. For 99% of people, there's therefore no question that you should do the one that doesn't assume you parry perfectly every time. But a lot more percentage of people than that's true for use that option. You know, a lot more people have a tendency to make a build assuming like everything goes perfectly, greedily, rather than thinking pragmatically, do I, equipping this set, actually do more damage? Even though if I were more skilled, I could do more damage, do I actually physically in practice do more damage when I equip these things that are theoretically ideal? Or most likely not, would it be better to just equip something that is consistent? Because I am not a perfect automata, and therefore if it's balanced, it's probably better to take the consistent thing. Anyway. And it's even a fallacy when it doesn't have to do with skill. I'm reminded of the example of Magic Missile in D&D. Magic Missile is a spell in D&D that does damage to 3 different targets, potentially more if you upcast it. And the gimmick of Magic Missile is that it can't miss, but the damage is low. Now, it's actually not. The average damage is the highest of most level 1 offensive cantrips, but only if you account for the misses. You'll look at the damage of another level 1 damage spell, and it will look way higher, in many ways more than twice as high for a lot of people. But if you really calculate it out and include the chance to miss with that other attack, it turns out Magic Missile is often the most damage at level 1. And especially depending on your stats, if your spellcasting stat is a little lower, your chance to hit would be lower, but it just isn't because Magic Missile doesn't miss, and the damage isn't affected either way. Of most spells, damage isn't affected by your spellcasting stat. So, therefore, you know, Magic Missile is better in those situations. It's surprising because it feels like 3d8 just is bigger though. I don't know. But of course it isn't. You know, 3d4 plus 3 is more if the 3d8 misses about half or a third of the time. Anyway, damage things aside, just to say that I think in many cases the game undoes this appeal by encourages people to be thinking this way. If the game tries to offer high enough gameplay difficulty, in other words, that it would create a state of flow, a lot of the time that causes people to instead change how they engage with the build system in a way that will damage that experience for them. Maybe it will give them the appeal of pulling the lever in some form, though I think for a lot of people they're getting that appeal by just memorizing everything in the game, not by really thinking through how to use the game elements flexibly. A lot of people with the strongest objective builds in these types of games don't have very good actual knowledge of making general builds. If you ask them to make a different kind of build, they wouldn't be very good at that. They don't They didn't ever do that. They just tried to make the build that was optimized in this very narrow way. They do not have much systemic mastery, even though they have a lot of system mastery. They know what a lot of the things in the game do, but not how to plug them in any useful ways other than this one. And that isn't the same appeal. That's fine, by the way, just to say, I mean, there is appeal that exists, that if you learn that other thing, you are losing something by trivializing the game down to that. It is less interesting in some ways for games to only be about that. Right. And therefore, there are developers that back off having these types of features in games, which I agree with you, Ragnavar, is a bit of a shame. I feel their benefits outweigh their detriments. I would always like for a game to offer higher difficulty that they make very clear isn't meant to be the main appeal, but it exists if you want it. And the highest difficulty they can get a lot of people to enjoy as the main thrust of the game, you know, or at least the end of the game. You reach the highest difficulty they thought was generally enjoyable. Is good. I would agree with that, right? So yeah, a really interesting one. A good example of an appeal that is more gameplay focused, or two, if you think of them as separate, and how a lot of games run awry of it a bit. But yeah, it's really interesting how player interpretation has an effect as well. Ragnavar continues, ironically, given that this was prompted due to watching the previous Crew Parley that it didn't respond to due to not having a cohesive idea, I think this is actually another piece where player immersion is key to ensuring a part of the game lands as developers intended. Immersion is the result of the player handing over more control over how they feel toward the experience and being rewarded for do so. And then it should be noted that you're saying player immersion can be different from character immersion, right? Not immersion in general. To my mind, the primary pitfall of focusing on the nebulous concept of immersion is making design decisions that are purely to move details out of menus, exposition, and video game logic physics, and put them into the world as fully conceived as possible, with so many details that other games would arguably rightly omit completely, if not leave at the bare minimum, in order to make the game feel real. This can work for some games that are explicitly trying to be more of a simulation, but if you're trying to be the next Skyrim and you're using the existence of immersion-focused mods for that game as a justification to go all in while still wanting to be mass marketable, you're either going to waste a bunch of time working on your piece, or more likely whoever is brought in to replace you, or you'll make a confused mess that only a few people like. This, Ragnavar, I'm sorry, this is the most enormous run-on sentence I've ever seen in actually literally my entire life, so here's your reward. The point you're making is that there is a problem that comes up when you try to make something immersive just by making it less like a video game, rather than making the player feel oriented into the game more, flowing with the game more. You can imagine how Ragnavar's point about flow and then the thing about systemic mastery is at odds with that, right? Making the game feel less video gamey often makes those things harder to feel and achieve, not easier. Personally, I feel like when I play most Skyrim-like games, for example, I feel like I'm fiddling with my controller for the right button to do the hotkey to do the thing in the environment I want to do much more than I would be with other games that are more gamey and streamlined, and this is very unimmersive, even though the game is trying to eliminate UI stuff and artifice to be more immersive. I almost always find those to be the most fiddly and the least flow-inducing games, and I really hate that. I hate that. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, in my opinion, are two examples of mega fiddly games to operate, which are, I think, in theory, trying to just let you enjoy the experience and go, go, go. And I just, for me, that is not working at all. In fact, basically everything they did just makes it worse than it would be if they had not done that. And I want a normal Zelda layout back. Anyway, but I like it being open world. They just went too far, I think. Topic for another time. I hope that future games are like that, but have slightly pared it back. And that would be great. So yes, I can definitely relate to that part of the feeling. Ragnavar says, to bring it together, I think these moments are when a player is actually immersed and engaged with what your game is trying to do. I love V4 Rusty's lines in Armored Core 6 because the character is well voice acted, well written for the kind of narrative being told, and is a likable, competent character giving cool one-liners that aren't over the top. and thus feel disingenuous, so unimmersive, something who talks like that. They don't overstay their welcome. Even more important in the mission I'm talking about, as a lot of characters are all talking throughout, but the dialogue isn't too much to be distracting, or have characters say line after line just to showcase the writing some more. They're just paced just so within the mission, with the music visuals. You're doing another run-on sentence again. Stop that. When I skimmed this, I must have been thinking, I get why you wrote it this way, because I thought it, and it was fine, and now I'm reading it out loud, and this is ridiculous. I get what you're saying. It is important that... I've edited a lot of people's work before, so it is genuinely saying something to say that's a long boy. Your point is really good. I don't want to undercut that. I think the appeal of these moments is primarily that they create a feeling of real immersion. Rather than it being that you just take stuff out of the UI, the things feel appropriate. They flow. The work itself flows. Rather than you feeling a state of flow immediately, it helps the audience get in that mindset by everything being thoughtfully designed to fit that moment, not dogmatically designed. There's no general rule that they try to use to get out of thinking about everything individually, and they instead just think through, in this moment, what would be an appropriate level of saying this to achieve the effect we want to achieve. So, as you say, you know, it's well voice acted, but also the voice direction was sensible for this moment. And that doesn't mean voice direction strictly creates these moments. It basically just means that good dynamic thinking is going to create games that give you these moments, that feel like the game just flows or feels reasonable or feasible in some in-universe way. Things don't have to feel real to feel this way. A really good example is Soul Eater in my mind. This is a show where the laws of reality have changed a little bit, if you're familiar with the Soul Eater Fire Force lore. But to wit, it's a cartoony show in some ways. Characters will hit each other on the head and there'll be an indent in their head a little bit. You know, it doesn't use our real universe physics or logic always, but it still uses its own in-universe physics or logic always. You know, there's still a feeling like when things happen in the world of Soul Eater, you vaguely understand, or somebody gets like stabbed in the chest and you go, that's bad, and they'll fight less well, but they'll be fine, rather than here where you go, oh, they're gonna get, you know, tetanus or whatever. It's not, you know, it has its own logic like that, but it's fairly consistent. Actually, injuries might not be, but in general, I think this point stands. The point is, there's a feeling of flow in the universe at times because everything works the way it works in Soul Eater consistently. There's no rule that can make this true, though you can have vague heuristics like, you know, Black Star can take way too much damage, for example. I don't know, okay, that's fine. Being durable allows you to survive a knife wound to the chest. Okay, like, no, but okay. Like, if it consistently does, then that's fine in theory, okay. And I think because that is the way it is, it feels unbrutal in a way, which is part of what Soul Eater / Fire Force is trying to do. It's trying to make moments of intense harm like that feel not comedic, but like a matter of course. To an extent, I think that's fine. It's an aesthetic. It's a common aesthetic in shonen anime in general, too. To an extent, the thing happening in Soul Eater is just a regularized form of what already happens in a lot of anime, where a character brushes off, frankly, a nuke falling on them, you know, without merely a scratch, provided they had the power of friendship. And so, you know, as long as it follows the rules of the universe, fine. You know, that's okay. It's similar to the example with Gandalf falling off. You shall not pass as the Balrog. This works because they're in a kind of barrier, sort of. It's dramatically appropriate. He falls. He's allowed to come back, but then doesn't directly resolve a lot of the plot coupon stuff. Why does he come back? Well, there isn't a hard magic explanation where it's like earned, or that's how physics works, or it was a tactical consequence of his actions. It's a soft magic reason. Dramatically, it is allowed for him to be able to return to aid the hobbits further, but now his dramatic agency has been reduced. Now, obviously, people who know the Lord of the Rings lore, I know, actually, technically, you could argue it is a hard magic reason secretly, but as presented in the movies, Gandalf comes back for a soft magic reason, I would argue. The movies do not contain any of that. So yes, there might be this other answer off page, but that doesn't matter for the text of the movie. In the movie, it's a soft magic reason. The point of which is that it follows the rules. It's not weird, really, when Gandalf falls or comes back. It's treated in universe like this happens. We live in a medieval society, and people sometimes just die. It's a war, you know. It's not happy or taken with no gravitas. But I think they did a fine job treating it like, what are we supposed to do? And they kind of move on, rather than always over dramatically wailing. Only wailing is a valid response to someone dying, which they actually might do in this case. But the point is, obviously it's reasonable for people to act other ways, and it's not a very interesting depiction of grief to think it just means you cry really loud. There's more to it than that, and as long as those things are appropriate and happen in their own time, I think it feels dramatically appropriate. You might have recommended this anime, Ragdavar, but I just started watching Journal with Witch, Ikoku Nikki. Ikoku is like a foreign land, and Nikki is diary. Ikoku Nikki, which is a show about a girl that loses her parents and lives with an eccentric aunt, and her reaction to her parents dying is initially very flat. And I don't think that comes across as unimmersive or unrealistic at all. It feels irregular to the moment, and this is something they unpack. You know, this person might be having trouble processing their emotions, but that doesn't mean they're like not upset or it's not bothering them or you ought not to do something to help. It's the same, and we see a lot of empathy from her aunt about that, or at least an attempt at understanding or helping in some way. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting case where it is not necessary for it to be the touchstone we normally think of, or like the traditional way of doing it, or, you know, immersive has to mean, oh, everything is the way you expect or something. It can absolutely be that it's just appropriate for the moment. And how is that constructed? I don't have an amazing answer for you. But yeah, there's a good part, Ragnavar. I'm sorry, I'm cutting into the middle of this because I swear there's like almost no periods in here. There's a way to pull the player into the moment with how FromSoft likely wanted you to feel, is that it's a tense mission, but you're doing it. Isn't it fun? You know, you're able to succeed in this moment of great danger. It's the feeling of the characters being in flow that they're trying to represent, I guess. And you can imagine somebody saying a cool but not ridiculous one-liner like that in that situation, I can imagine. And so it feels appropriate. There's all these war stories of people riding high on the danger, likely the endorphins, of combat or a dogfight or something, and saying something crazy or yeehaw or, you know, a random exclamation like that. It's just kind of what humans do in these situations sometimes. And so I can imagine how it might feel appropriate for someone to say a kind of cool, kind of corny one-liner in a situation like that. It feels like, oh no, but that does kind of reflect human nature. With the example of Monster Hunter Wilds free challenges, this is the game asking you to take the exam on that arch-tempered monster. Each has aspects that want to be considered in your set building, itemization, meal choice, and moment-to-moment gameplay, the different parts of the build system, even if the player decides that aspect isn't worth the extra effort to counter with specific choices. And then ask the player to choose the weapon they can most comfortably get good damage per second with, without playing too riskily. As a feint and the run back take time that many sets can't afford if the player isn't able to adapt to make up for it, if it's possible at all to do so. You're right, because it's a timed challenge, so you can die, but oftentimes if you play unsafely and die, you lose so much time it doesn't matter. You won't have gained damage. To get the A rank and get into the participation leaderboards at all genuinely feels like a small piece of meaningful mastery over everything your build and weapon offered against that monster, and encourages players to go and do the thing, which, should they succeed, the player looking and feeling great doing it. Absolutely, right. I think this is a great way to bring home the point you made before, that the game offering a not necessarily even more challenging, though it usually will be more challenging, way to play, but just the moment where the player is meant to bring it all together a little bit and use everything they have. Right. There's definitely been games I've played, for example, where I have a lot of systemic mastery, and I have many different kinds of builds that are good at different things. I would be very excited to play a game mode that asked me to go all out and use all of them. There will be trash mobs to clear. There will be easy stuff that you want to clear really efficiently and quickly, or in like the least turns possible. There will be really long endurance-based fights with a ton of health where you need to survive for a long time. There'll be fights where you need to counter specific mechanics, and fights where there are no specific mechanics to counter. There'll be fights against multiple targets and fights against single targets. There'll be all of it, and you have to bring a ton of builds and tackle it all. That appeals to me a lot. I think that's really cool. Having that exist in games, at the very least, is nice as a kind of final exam, but the positive version kind of thing. There's an interesting line, ironically, from Soul Eater. The house cat, which, if you know Blair, I don't know if you really count her as a cat, but anyway, their cat, is asking Maka whether she likes tests, or are tests fun? And Maka says they are. It's kind of like a game where you get to see how well you scored on everything you've learned so far. Yeah, Maka, it would be like that. It would be, but for most people, it's instead distracted by anxiety about their life being failed by this stupid abstraction of their intelligence. Tests don't work for that at all, but I obviously understand what you mean. It would be fun to have something that was a sort of final exam that was about play, but when it's a test with like real life consequences and stakes, right. The distinction of a game is generally that there are no real life consequences beyond your time. And so, yeah, no, I think it is like a positive test in the game. Having a part of the game where it says bring everything together, and this is really an end game type of experience a lot of the time. You get this feeling of systemic mastery and flow at a really powerful way. I really like that. I agree. I think a lot of games do a little of this and have like a penultimate challenge, but unfortunately what I've seen a lot of the time is that the game has many ways to play, but very rarely mixes those ways. And I personally think there's a value in combining them specifically. That would be a way many games could add no real additional content, but just splice together those challenges. And that could be an interesting mode of play. Especially good when a game has a lot of different ways to play, because it can be tiring too. I think it's worth noting for some of these that there's often a bit of a cooldown on human impact. This is a subject of a lot of interest to me. I'm a person who is going to finish this parlay with a significant tangent, but I think it will be of interest to you if you thought the psychology of these impactful moments was interesting. So the idea basically is that human beings have a limit on how much they will experience wonder or surprise or horror. Not because we like mature out of it necessarily, that happens to an extent, sure, but primarily what I'm talking about is the moment to moment within a day. If you see 3 hugely shocking horror things, the third one is lacking some catalyst inside of you, mentally or maybe even physiologically, maybe physically, there's a neurotransmitter lacking, that you cannot be more than so much shocked, you know? You get kind of reverse shell-shocked, and you aren't really surprised by things anymore in a certain way. There's even a kind of phrase people will say for this. Well, they'll say something like, remarking in passing, after how today's gone, I wouldn't be surprised by anything. And it's kind of a real phenomenon, don't you think? At some point, even if bad things are happening, people start changing their behavior. They roll their eyes, or they joke cynically, or they joke genuinely about the thing happening. It becomes ridiculous and different in a way. It becomes different, and I think we also get a kind of surprise fatigue as well. I don't know where this is from in me. This is just something I've become very fascinated by recently. And it's important because in the modern age, you may be brushing up against the earliest moments where humanity will have so much entertainment that you will be able to have huge life-changing experiences back to back to back, potentially. And it therefore matters, for arguably the first time in history, to consider slowing them down on purpose. That is, purposefully not including as many good pieces of entertainment as you otherwise would. I think a lot of people are not at this point yet. If you don't want this, I don't think that that's like ignoble of you. There's nothing wrong with you. It makes total sense. The reason to want this would be to adapt to finally having enough of that. If you don't have enough of that, it's completely reasonable to just want more. you shouldn't feel weird or like you're actually wasting the enjoyment or whatever. Just that if you do eventually feel like there is enough, that it's saturating your life. Yeah, I think you can increase the impact of things by spacing them out in a certain way. I reckon that for a certain type of emotional peak, you basically have a cooldown of that day on having that emotional peak to that degree again. If you have a really loving moment with someone and you have another one, it's only going to be so much more impactful. That doesn't make it bad, but if you were going out of your way to do like a ton of stuff for someone, it would probably make a bigger difference to them if it was spread out. Just as a simple example, my partner and I have often talked about giving gifts to each other and concluded that we prefer spreading them out over a little while instead of one day. So rather than having a birthday celebration, if we decide to do a thing that year, we'll do it for a week. In December, when a lot of the United States around me celebrates Christmas, we do absolutely nothing special on the day of Christmas, but for the entire month give each other here and there little gifts, only up to one per day. We often hide them in the apartment, just in plain sight, and you'll be going about your business and go, hey, look, a new bag of coffee. Thanks. Sweet. For me, probably, presumably. Or there'll be like a new book next to the book you were reading, and you'll go, oh, right, as a gift. Great, thank you. Glorious. And I just think that's more fun that way. If you give them like 10 things, I often have this feeling after a holiday or a birthday when I've been given gifts where I feel very thankful to have gotten all these gifts, so I feel kind of bad that I'm having trouble actually processing. I don't even know how to say it really, like all of the things that happened. This is much more common as a sentiment with negative experiences. People have trouble processing all of the crazy stuff that happened to them. And it's most common that people will say, I'm still trying to process everything that happened. There is something going on there. It's not true that you like don't get surprised or shocked or upset necessarily, I don't think. But I do still think there's meaningful contents there, that there's a limit to how much you can feel that emotional turbulence. And this is of interest in particular, in my opinion, because it means that games that want you to experience flow, or like those mechanical appeals, do well to have lots of the rest of the game that is not like that. So I suggested a mode where you bring all the different types of gameplay or a bunch of different build niches together, and you ask the player to use a ton of builds to kind of attack them all. And that will feel fulfilling in a very unique way, if that is not the primary way the player plays. There's this thing in a lot of games nowadays where there's like a monthly or every few weeks reset, like challenge dungeon, and you bring your best units and you try to kill all the enemies in the shortest amount of turns or the shortest time, and you just do the best you can, and then you get rewards based on how fast you went. It's not a bad thing to include in these games, and I think it is particularly good because it is a limited time thing. That is, not that you have limited time to do it, but that you only do it and benefit from doing it like once every few weeks, maybe taking a few hours or an hour in some cases. I think that's like the right interval in many ways. You see what I mean? If you were doing that every week for rewards, that would affect how it would feel to the player. Not only would it just be logistically a bit fatiguing, it would also be sort of less satisfying, I would argue. It feels like you get a test. You need to have had long enough for things to have meaningfully progressed as well. And so that's another aspect. Yeah, I think a lot of the time when things stick with us too, it's because they've taught us something about ourselves. And so on another level, if something like the Majora's Mask thing has an impact on you, similar philosophical things coming up will often not have much of an effect. It's kind of done the same thing, and it will often take you literally just changing a bit as a person for something like that to have a meaningful effect again, because now it has a different context. You've changed. So the cooldown aspect of these things interests me a lot as well. You can't necessarily just have these appeals back to back. Now, that being said, in video games, if you have a wide enough taste in video games, I don't know, man. I mean, you could just like play different things, and you probably mostly will be able to not avoid these, and you'll enjoy them. Enough games don't reach for a moment like this, that if you just play a mix of games, you'd probably be fine to just go for these as much as you want. So I don't know. I just think it's interesting to consider in life in general. Sometimes you had a really good day and I think, oh, let's start this new game. But I'm kind of going to make it less good than it would be. If I start it some other time, I might enjoy it more. I don't know. Something to think about. Again, for many people, probably not a relevant thought at this point in most people's existence, but I have the very good fortune, partly significantly with all of your good recommendations, that I do often feel like, maybe I pare it back a little. You know, I finished this giant book. Maybe I don't start the next one today. That's maybe that would be a bit of a waste in some way. I have a ton of other good games that I want to play. Maybe I'll just go do that instead. Varying it up maybe makes that feel better. To me anyway, and I imagine for eventually it might be better for a lot of people. I hope this was an interesting look at these. This was an interesting one. I feel like there's a lot to say about your responses. They were all really different. We got a really good spread, as is often the case in these. Ragnavar, I hope I didn't poke too much fun at your insane run-on sentences. I'm genuinely actually in awe. They do kind of like flow, you know what I mean? Like to some extent you can kind of say it works, but man, when I read through this preparing for the parlay, I did not understand how hard it was going to be to read. God damn. Partly my fault. It was a good point. They were good points that I hope I was able to still unpack well, despite not perfectly reading through. It's almost impossible to perfectly read through the thing that you wrote. What you're saying is very interesting. I think that's a very good point. The mechanical appeals, moments that mechanically stick with you, of mastery, is another really interesting way to look at this subject, both flow and system/systemic mastery with build systems. I do reckon, I wanted to say quickly, that those appeals might be a little more similar between games. In a lot of Souls-likes, the feeling of flow or system mastery may feel very similar to other Souls-likes, for example. So I also want to say that that might be a little less unique, but I also think you can have very many unique experiences with this. I had a really interesting one recently where I was playing Arco, and I'm in a part of Arco where you play as Itzai. She's Itzai. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right. She's a brawler. She's a sort of tank, physical combatant, pugilist, wrestler, mix of those fighting styles. She's a tanky melee combatant. And there's a scene where you go to a gladiatorial arena and win the contest, but as you're in the final round, someone gets poisoned and you get blamed for cheating, even though as far as you know you didn't do it, and guards surround you and attack you. And I killed them all. And then guards surround you and attack you, and I killed them all. And that happens 2 more times and I killed all of them, and it was pretty hard. And there was a wave of corpses all over the battlefield. And the developer popped up and said, all right, enough of this. Yeah, we get it. You're very good at the game. Let's put you back in prison and get the game back on track. Now, I have a mixture of feelings about that moment. I kind of wish they'd just played it out and said the guards eventually kill you, but this is an ending to the game. A little bit like Nier Automata style lettered endings. If you die in some way permanently, the game says this is just one of the ways the story can end, and you load to the last save. And it describes it diegetically in the universe, what happens, and then that's the end of the story in this case. I prefer that approach, but anyway, it stuck with me, right? Because the developer is saying, we put this in, but we thought it was unlikely enough that players would experience it that we fourth wall broke when in a game where they don't do that at all, if you do it. And I thought, was I really that good at this game? Like, it was hard. I don't know. I guess I tried hard, but like, I guess I made something quite powerful. And when I looked at like, what is the engine I'm using? It's kind of unbeatable. That might be literally mathematically unbeatable if I don't just play wrong or like get lazy or something. All the times I died were just me getting lazy. It was an interesting moment where I felt like that this build is better than I thought. I made this. It was me. The developers kind of led me to something vaguely similar, but wow, like that. I didn't know that was that good, and the game kind of just randomly tested me, I guess. There was a moment where you were meant to hit against your limits, but then you went past them, which I think is really interesting. I didn't even have to. I wasn't even trying that hard necessarily. I just tried to make a build that was good. It's an interesting moment like that, to see a perspective on the way you're playing that you didn't think of yourself. Even if it's arguably not actually that hard, just thinking of it as like, what you did actually is pretty extreme. What the hell? Why did you kill all those guys? And I went, I don't know. I thought there would be content, I guess. I'm sorry. I don't know. I thought I was supposed to. Not really. The game did say, like, you just accept getting arrested, but I didn't do anything wrong. I don't know. So I killed all those people. But she would kill all those people. Anyway, I don't know. It was an interesting moment like that. Look at this. I did share a candid one. It was a bizarre moment like that. So I don't know. I guess they can be kind of unique. But you get my point. Obviously, feeling system mastery in a game or flow for playing a certain type of combat in a game, like a first-person shooter would be another good example category, may feel more similar from game to game to game. And so how does that affect the feeling of enjoyment? Anyway, a really interesting parlay. I'm really happy that we asked for community parlay, crew parlay recommendation ideas because they've been good. This is a good one. And I would not have thought to ask people this. Again, I might have slightly chickened out of asking people this. So good on you, Mr. Fu. Well done. And folks, if you'd like your own one of these, you can get a normal parlay, your prompt, and I just do the whole video about that, using a link in the description. Crew Parlay is open to people at my lower tier on Patreon. So the idea is that this is, it's not as specific to just you, so we can do it together more if I propose a prompt and then you all do little responses. They don't have to be really little. Some of these weren't. This can be a longer video. That's fine. This is a pretty normal length for these, an hour and a half, yeah. And eventually they're probably going to get long enough that I'll take a break, like drink water in the middle of them. Slurp. And that's completely fine. Not a big deal. That's intended. These are a little longer. No big deal. I take a little less time with each person's point usually, and may need to take even less time sometimes, but not a big deal. It's open to more people. So if you're already a patron or something, I want you to know you already have access to this in all likelihood. I also do that for Twitch Prime. So if you're a Twitch subscriber, you have a normal one or a paid one, or you have Twitch Prime, you can get this for free. If you have your Discord account synced up, you just get access to this. You can respond in the thread every month. We would love to have you. So if you're interested in that, again, a lot of you already have access to this. Looking forward to the next one. Now, at the end of these, I usually read the next month's prompt, but right now we're behind by a few, so we'll really just one more. So I will redo the current next month's prompt when I get to that next one. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy the next one of these. I am excited about the next few. I feel like it worked to try to get better at writing prompts. Like, I feel like these have been going better. Anyway, cool. Good stuff.